Well, I'm excited to keep talking to you about the Supernatural series. This week's lesson is going to be kind of a continuation of last week's. You call it The Gods Were On. And last week we looked a lot about how the Exodus narrative discusses God's defeat of these false gods we see, the sons of God. And it the thing about it is, though, last week's, while it's fun, exciting, is far from the only instance where God humiliates these spiritual imposters. So we're going to jump right in, and we are going to do some more Mesopotamian mythology here. So Dagon is one of the chief deities of the Philistines and the Assyrians. This is a picture of Dagon right here. He's half man, half fish, and he is one of these deities that they worship, and he's the chief deity of the Philistines. They believed that he was actually the father of Baal. He was the god of grain and the god of fish, and because crops and fishing were two of the primary ways that they received their food, he was the god over the fertility of the earth. So the earth producing food for them to eat. He was said to be the inventor of the plow, and so this is who Dagon is to them. Now Yahweh goes head to head with Dagon multiple different times within the Bible, and one important detail about pagan practices is how they verified that a man or a woman of the gods was a legitimate messenger. So, like, somebody shows up, they say, "Hey, I have a message from the gods." They they had to be trusted some way, and so they had a method within pagan practices to know that this message was legitimate. Um, so, multiple ancient texts, they mention that when someone claimed to speak for the gods, they had to provide a sample of their hair and the hem of their garment. Now, this was to complete some kind of test to determine the legitimacy of the messenger, and archaeologists they unearthed a series of tablets known as the Mari tablets. Now, these are a series of letters that are important within archaeology. They're administrative texts, they're religious documents. It's like a whole group of tablets known as the Mari tablets from the Babylonian era. And multiple different times they actually reference this practice. I'm going to read for you several quotes. "And since the man is trustworthy, I did not take his hair or his fringe. Here I hereby send Aham's letter and the female ecstatic's hair and fringe to my lord. I now hereby send to my lord the fringe of his garment and the lock of his head. The second day, Aham the priest brought me this report, the hair and the fringe, and I have written to my lord, the hair and the fringe I have sealed and sent to my lord." And so there was something about the person's hair that marked them as the messenger of the gods. And so this detail becomes really important when we read the story of Samson. The power of God in the story of Samson is residing in what part of Samson? His hair. And so when the Philistines capture him, they gouge out his eyes and they cut off his hair. And so this leads to Yahweh's humiliation of Dagon and his worshippers as we get to the end of the story. I'm going to read for you starting in Judges chapter 16, verse 22. "However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to be glad. And they said, Our God has given Samson our enemy into our hands. And the people saw him and praised their gods, for they said, Our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us. So it happened when their hearts were merry that they said, Call for Samson, that he may amuse us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he entertained them. And they made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, Let me feel the pillars on which the house is established, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking on while Samson was amusing them. Then Samson called to Yahweh and said, O Lord Yahweh, please remember me and please strengthen me just this time. O God, that I may at once be avenged the Philistines from my two eyes. Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house was established and supported himself against them, the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with his strength, so the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he put to death by his death were more than those whom he put to death in his life. Okay, so 3,000 pagan worshippers, they're assembling in the temple of Dagon to celebrate the might of their god. He's delivered their enemy into their hands. Samson has been captured. He's been this torment for them for forever. And in the midst of this drunken revelry that Samson, the messenger of God, whose hair had returned, he displays that Yahweh's might has not disappeared, that Yahweh has not been defeated. And in the middle of the temple of Dagon, he collapses the entire temple and destroys every single last one. So, in mockery, with his arms outstretched, just like the future Messiah, Samson goes ahead and he gives his life to defeat the forces of evil. Now, there's one other story of note where God humiliates and defeats Dagon in his own temple. So in 1 Samuel, the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, and it says in chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, "Now the Philistines took the Ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the Ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon." So, what was the Ark of the Covenant? It was the throne of God. God's very presence rested on the Ark. 1 Samuel 4:4 actually describes it as the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of Hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. So on the cherubim on the top, this is literally God's throne. God's actual presence came to rest here. And so the Philistines, they take the very God of the Israelites, into the temple of their chief God, and they set it up next to the statue as a sign of their God's might and the fact that Yahweh is subservient to Dagon, that he serves him. He is nothing compared to Dagon. But they're in for a surprise, because the next morning God had this surprise for them. 1 Samuel 5:3. Then the Ashdodites rose early the next morning, and behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Yahweh. So they took Dagon and they set him in his place again. They come in to discover that their God is bowing down on his face before the Ark of the Covenant. And so they look at it and say, "Oh man, that's unfortunate. He fell off his pedestal." So they set him back up again. I say, "Okay, well, that was weird, but you know what? He's been dignified again. He is fine. Let's put him back up. Come back again tomorrow." Well, God wasn't done there. And so in verses 4 through 5, we see, "But they rose early the next morning. Behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of Yahweh. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the thresholds. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor all who entered Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day." So not only had Dagon fallen on before the ark again, like bowing down before him, but his heads and his hands had completely broken off. And so, something you need to understand about ancient Near East customs is that it was very common for victors to humiliate the captive soldiers by cutting off their hands and their feet. And so, this also, it wasn't just humiliating, but it made sure that the captive would never rise up again and battle against the enemy force. When we look at this, and Dagon's hands have been broken off, his head has been broken off, and he's laying there just a trunk on the floor, Yahweh had not only humiliated and captured their God, Yahweh had beheaded him. He had been slain, and their God laid in death and humiliation, bowing down before the Ark of the Covenant. Now, there's another story in Scripture where we see God's war against these pagan gods. And this is a classic one. It's a story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You might know it. But in 1 Kings 18, there's been this drought. It's been going on for a long, long time. James 5:17 says, "Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months." Can you imagine 3 years, 6 months without any rain? the earth was dry. They needed rain. They had to have their crops weren't growing. They were starving, and so things are pretty dire right now for Israel. And so Elijah arranges a meeting with this evil king of Israel known as Ahab, and he offers this challenge we read in 1 Kings 18:17 through 20. Now it happened when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said to him, "Is this you, you troubler of Israel?" And he said, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of Yahweh, and you have followed the Baals. So now then, send and gather to me all of Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." And so he challenges these 850 prophets of Baal and of Ishtar to prove whose deity is more powerful. Now, do you remember who Baal was? If you remember the last few lessons, Baal was Satan. And he sets and Elijah sets this location of Mount Carmel. So in Hebrew, Mount Carmel itself means fruit garden or orchard. Now, I don't know about you, but I never quite pictured a fruit garden or an orchard altar. I always kind of just pictured this arid desert mountain where they're all up on top of. But in Hebrew, it means fruit garden. Now, that would indicate that that Mount Carmel was the location of a mountain garden. It's like an orchard up there. And what other significant mountain gardens are there in Scripture? The Garden of Eden. And so, what was the challenge that Elijah made? Well, continuing on in verse 20. So Ahab sent a messenger among all the people, sons of Israel, and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you be limping between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." But the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I alone am left a prophet of Yahweh, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now let them give us 2 oxen, and let them choose 1 ox for themselves, and cut it up, and place it on the wood. But place no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox, and put it on the wood, and I will not place fire under it. Then you can call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahweh. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered and said, "That is good. But place no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox, and put it on the wood, and I will not place fire under it. Then you will call on the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of Yahweh. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered, "That is good." So Elijah says that whoever's God can send fire from heaven to this pre-prepared sacrifice on the altar. That God is going to be the true God. Now, remember, what was Baal god of? He was the god of storms. So this should be an easy task for him. He's the god of storms. All he needs to do is send a bolt of lightning down to consume the offering. But continuing in verse 25. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose 1 ox for yourselves, and prepare it for first, for you are many, and call on the name of your God, but place no fire under it." And then they took the ox on which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from the morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." And there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped about the altar which they had made. Now it happened at noon that Elijah mocked them, and said, "Call out with a loud voice, for he is God. Either he is occupied, or relieving himself, or is on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened." So they cried out with a loud voice, and gnashed themselves according to their custom, with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out of them. Now it happened when noon had passed, that they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. So Elijah, he looks at this situation, he makes him this challenge, and then he proceeds to just trash talk the hound out of these prophets. He's like, maybe Baal's on vacation. Maybe he's taking a nap. Maybe he's even stuck on the toilet. You never know with these gods. They're fickle. I'm sure he'll answer you at some point. And so the lack of success, it leads to these false prophets who begin to take it even more seriously. And they double down. They're offering their own blood. They're cutting themselves. They're giving their lives on the altar just to try and get Baal to answer. But the gods remain silent, which leads us to verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of Yahweh which had been pulled down, sorry. Then Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of Yahweh had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of Yahweh, and he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. Then he arranged the wood, and he cut the ox in pieces, and he placed it on the wood. And he said, Fill 4 pitchers with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. Then he said, Do it a second time. And they looked for it. They did it a second time. And he said, Do it a third time. They did it a third time. The water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. Now it happened at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your slave, and I have done all these things. Your word, at your word, answer me, O Yahweh. Answer me that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back again. Then the fire of Yahweh fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And all the people saw it and fell on their faces, and said, Yahweh, he is God, Yahweh, he is God. Then Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let any one of them escape. So they seized him, and Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon, and slaughtered them there. So what do we have in this story? Well, when the storm god is unable to send fire from heaven, Yahweh was able to consume the offerings. But not just the offerings, the wood, the stones turned into dust. And despite the fact that they had been drenched in water, they are completely burnt up into dust. Now, on a mountain representing Eden, the location of the original rebellion, it's there that Yahweh's prophet puts all of the false prophets to death. This event literally on a fruit garden mountain, Mount Carmel. On it, the mountain is the symbolism is so clear when you realize what Mount Carmel was. And it's on this mountain that God throws down with Baal and Ishtar again. But his victory wasn't complete. There was still a drought. And so Baal, the storm god who had failed to bring rain for 3.5 years, is once again called to take account. 1 Kings 18:41 through 46. Now Elijah said to Ahab, Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of the tumult of rain. So Ahab went up to eat and drink, but Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he stretched himself down toward the ground, and put his face between his knees, and he said to his young man, Go up now, look at the sea. So he went up and looked, and said, There is nothing. He said, Go back 7 times. Now it happened at the 7th time that he said, Behold, a cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea. And he said, Go up, say to Ahab, Prepare your chariot and go down, so the rain does not stop you. Now it happened that in a little while, the sky grew dark with clouds and wind, and there was heavy rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel, but the hand of Yahweh was on Elijah. And he girded up his loins and outran Ahab into where you enter Jezreel. So, 3.5 years without rain. And Elijah, when the servant of God asks God for something, God answers immediately. And in the end, all the land saw that the one and only God who could control the storms was not Baal. The most powerful gods were not Baal and Ishtar, and all their supposed power was found only in the El Elohim, the God of gods. And so while Satan may have thought he won up on the mountaintop Garden of Eden, Yahweh reminds him on a mountaintop garden of his complete and total insignificance. It's a beautiful story. It's exciting to read when you get the added perspective. And as always, if you have any questions, reach out, let me know.